The November rain drummed against the funeral home windows like impatient fingers, each drop a reminder that even the sky was weeping for Sebastian. I stood in the corner of the viewing room, watching strangers file past my husband's casket, offering their condolences with the practiced ease of people who'd never known real loss. My black dress, the same one I'd worn to my mother's funeral 5 years ago, hung loose on my frame. 62 years old, and I'd shrunk into something I barely recognized. "Mom, you need to eat something." Penelope's voice cut through my thoughts. My daughter appeared beside me, her perfectly manicured hand holding a paper plate with crackers and cheese that might as well have been cardboard. At 35, she'd inherited her father's sharp features and my stubborn streak, though she'd weaponized both in ways I'd never imagined. "I'm fine," I murmured, keeping my eyes fixed on Sebastian's peaceful face. Even in death, he looked disappointed in me. 43 years of marriage, and I'd never quite lived up to his expectations. Now I never would. "Mom." Penelope's tone carried that familiar edge of impatience. "People are asking questions. About the house. About your plans. You need to think about what you're going to do." The house. Our house. The 4-bedroom colonial in Westchester where we'd raised our children, where I'd hosted countless dinner parties, where I'd waited up nights worrying about homework and first dates and college applications, where I'd nursed Sebastian through his final months of lung cancer, watching him fade away one painful day at a time. "I'm not going anywhere," I said quietly. "That's my home." Penelope's laugh was brittle. "Mom, be realistic. You can't afford that place on your own. Dad's life insurance will help, but the mortgage, the taxes, the maintenance—" I said I'm not going anywhere. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, drawing glances from nearby mourners. I lowered my voice. This is not the time or place for this conversation. But Penelope had never known when to stop pushing. She'd been that way since childhood, relentless, entitled, always convinced she knew better than everyone else. "Actually, it is the perfect time. Michael and I have been talking, and we think you should consider assisted living. There's a really nice place in—" "Assisted living?" The words hit me like a physical blow. "Penelope, I'm 62 years old. I'm not an invalid." "No, but you're not exactly thriving either, are you?" Her voice had taken on that patronizing tone she'd perfected during her MBA program. "When's the last time you left the house for something other than Dad's doctor appointments? When's the last time you saw friends? You've been so focused on being his caretaker that you've forgotten how to live your own life." I wanted to tell her that caring for the man I loved wasn't a burden. It was a privilege. That watching him slip away hadn't diminished me. It had shown me what true devotion looked like. But the words stuck in my throat like thorns. "Penelope, please. Not today." "Mom, I'm trying to help you here." She moved closer, her perfume, something expensive and cold, making my eyes water. "Michael's been looking at your finances. The house is worth almost $2 million now. If you sell it, you could live very comfortably somewhere smaller, more manageable. You could even help us with Emma's college fund." There it was, the real reason for her sudden concern about my living situation. Emma was their daughter, my granddaughter, a sweet 16-year-old who'd been accepted to Princeton, pending the massive tuition payments that would drain even Michael's surgeon salary. "We'll discuss this later," I said firmly, but Penelope was already shaking her head. "No, Mom, we're discussing it now. Before you make any rash decisions about staying in that house you can't afford." The funeral director appeared at my elbow, his practiced sympathy as artificial as the flowers surrounding Sebastian's casket. "Mrs. Morrison, we're ready for the service to begin." I nodded, grateful for the interruption. As we made our way to the chapel, I caught sight of my son Carter near the entrance. At 38, he'd grown into a man I barely recognized. Expensive suit, perfect hair, the kind of polished appearance that came from years of climbing corporate ladders. He was deep in conversation with his wife Linda, their heads bent together in what looked like an urgent discussion. The service passed in a blur of hymns and eulogies, words about Sebastian's dedication to his family and his successful accounting practice. I sat in the front row, flanked by my children, feeling more alone than I had in the weeks since Sebastian's death. They'd arranged everything, the flowers, the music, even the reception afterward, without consulting me once. I was the grieving widow, the broken old woman who couldn't be trusted to make decisions about her own husband's funeral. After the burial, we returned to the funeral home for the reception. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting condolences with nods and murmured thanks. People spoke about Sebastian in past tense, as if he'd already been erased from existence. But I could still feel him everywhere, in the way the afternoon light slanted through the windows, in the scent of his cologne that seemed to linger in the air. "Aunt Ellen?" A young woman approached me, her face familiar but aged beyond my memory. "I'm Jessica, Carter's cousin from Chicago. I'm so sorry for your loss." I remembered her now. Carter's sister's daughter, a girl who'd spent summers with us when she was little. She'd grown into a poised woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile. "Jessica, of course. Thank you for coming." "Uncle Sebastian was such a wonderful man," she said, her voice soft with genuine grief. "I remember how he used to take us fishing at the lake, how patient he was when we couldn't cast the line properly. For the first time all day, I felt tears threaten. He loved those fishing trips. He always said watching you kids discover the world was better than any vacation." I wanted to ask, Jessica glanced around nervously, "Is it true that you're selling the house? Carter mentioned something about assisted living, but that seems crazy to me. You're so young, and that house is filled with such beautiful memories." Before I could answer, Carter appeared at my side. His face was tight with the kind of controlled anger I remembered from his teenage years. "Jessica, Mom's had a long day. Maybe we should let her rest." I know what you were doing." Carter's voice had an edge that made Jessica step back. "And I'd appreciate it if you didn't upset my mother with questions about private family matters." Jessica's cheeks flushed red. "I wasn't trying to upset anyone. I just think—" "Nobody asked what you think." The words came out like a slap, and I saw Jessica flinch. "This is between me, my sister, and my mother. Not extended family who show up once a decade for funerals." "Carter," I started to protest, but he'd already turned his attention to me. "Mom, we need to talk. Now." He guided me toward a corner of the room, his grip on my elbow firm enough to leave marks. Penelope joined us, her face set in the same determined expression she'd worn as a child when she wanted something badly enough to fight for it. "Mom, we've been thinking," Carter began, his voice taking on the same patronizing tone Penelope had used earlier. "About your situation, about what Dad would have wanted. What your father wanted was for me to be happy," I said quietly. "In the home we built together." "Mom, be reasonable." Penelope moved closer, effectively trapping me between them. "You can't live in that house alone. It's too big, too expensive, too much work. You'll be miserable." "I'm miserable now," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. "My husband is dead. I buried him 3 hours ago. Of course I'm miserable." "That's exactly why you need to make smart decisions," Carter said. "Not emotional ones. Dad left you provided for, but not if you're going to waste money on a house you don't need." "Waste money?" The words came out louder than I'd intended, drawing glances from nearby mourners. "That house is our home. It's where you grew up, where your children visit for holidays, where your father and where Dad died." Penelope interrupted. "Mom, every room in that house is going to remind you of his illness, of watching him suffer. How is that healthy? And what about us?" Carter's voice had taken on a wheedling quality that made my skin crawl. "Penelope and I both have kids to think about. College tuitions, mortgage payments. If you sold the house, you could help us out. Make sure your grandchildren have the opportunities they deserve." There it was again. The real reason for their sudden concern about my living situation. They wanted my money. They wanted me to liquidate the life Sebastian and I had built together so they could pay for their own choices. "Your father and I already helped you," I said, my voice steady, despite the rage building in my chest. "We paid for your educations, your weddings, the down payments on your first homes. We babysat your children, helped you through every crisis. What more do you want from me?" "Mom, we're not asking for charity," Penelope said. "We're asking you to be practical, to think about the future." "Whose future?" I asked. "Mine? Or yours?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. Carter's face had gone red, the way it always did when he was about to lose his temper. Penelope's jaw was set in a hard line that reminded me painfully of her father. "You know what?" Carter's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Dad was right about you. You've always been selfish. Always put your own feelings ahead of what's best for the family." The words hit me like a physical blow. Sebastian had said that? About me? "That's not true," I whispered, but Carter was already shaking his head. "It is true. You spent his last months making everything about you. Your grief, your fears, your inability to let go. You made his death about your loss instead of celebrating his life. How dare you?" The words came out in a voice I didn't recognize, cold, sharp, deadly. "How dare you speak to me that way at your father's funeral?" "I'll speak to you however I want," Carter said, his voice rising. "You're not the victim here, Mom. You're a grown woman who needs to stop acting like a child and start making responsible decisions." The entire room had gone quiet. I could feel dozens of eyes on us, watching the Morrison family fall apart in real time. But I couldn't stop myself from fighting back. "Responsible decisions?" I laughed, the sound bitter and harsh. "Like giving up my home so you can afford your children's private schools? Like moving into some institutional facility so you don't have to worry about taking care of me the way I took care of you?" "Yes," Carter said simply. "Exactly like that." The slap came without warning. His hand connected with my cheek with a crack that echoed through the suddenly silent room. I stumbled backward, my hand flying to my burning face, Sebastian's funeral program fluttering to the floor like a dying bird. "Dad was the only reason you had a roof over your head," Carter said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "Now you're just a burden. A selfish, ungrateful burden who can't see past her own needs." I stood there, trembling, my cheek on fire, watching my son's face twist with a hatred I'd never seen before. Around us, the funeral guests stared in shock, their whispered conversations filling the air like the buzz of angry wasps. Penelope moved to Carter's side, her face pale but her eyes hard. "Mom, you need help. Professional help. This conversation proves it." I bent down slowly, picked up Sebastian's program, and straightened. My cheek still burned, but something else was burning too. Something deeper, colder, more permanent. "I think," I said quietly, "that we're done here." I walked out of the funeral home with my head held high, leaving my children and their shocked guests behind. The rain had stopped, and the late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. Beautiful, I thought. Even in November, the world could still be beautiful. I drove home to my house, not theirs, and sat in Sebastian's chair in the living room. The silence felt different now. Not empty, but full of possibility. On the coffee table, his reading glasses sat exactly where he'd left them, still holding the shape of his face. 3 days later, a stranger knocked on Carter's door. The stranger who knocked on Carter's door wore a crisp gray suit and carried a leather briefcase that gleamed like polished obsidian. Her name was Lydia Johnson, and she was a forensic accountant, the kind of professional who could unravel financial mysteries with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a hunter. I watched from my car across the street as Carter answered the door, his face shifting from annoyance to confusion to something that looked suspiciously like fear. Linda appeared behind him, her yoga outfit incongruous against the gravity of the moment. Even from a distance, I could see the exact moment when Lydia Johnson introduced herself and explained why she was there. The expression on my son's face was worth every penny I'd paid her. You see, there's something my children never understood about their father and me. We weren't just husband and wife. We were partners in every sense of the word. While Sebastian handled the public face of our accounting firm, I was the one who understood the intricate web of investments, trusts, and financial instruments that comprised our real wealth. I was the one who suggested we establish the family trust 20 years ago, the one who insisted on specific clauses that my children had never bothered to read. The same children who assumed I was just a helpless widow who didn't understand money. 3 days after the funeral, I'd called Lydia Johnson. Her reputation preceded her. She was the kind of forensic accountant who could trace money through offshore accounts and shell corporations. who could untangle the most complex financial frauds. But this wasn't fraud. This was justice. I need you to investigate my son's business practices, I'd told her during our first meeting. I have reason to believe he's been misappropriating funds from client accounts. It wasn't a lie. Sebastian had suspected something for months before his death. Carter worked for a prestigious investment firm in Manhattan, managing portfolios for wealthy clients. He'd been living beyond his means for years. The house in Scarsdale, the luxury cars, the private schools for his children. His salary was substantial, but not substantial enough to support the lifestyle he'd adopted. "What kind of evidence do you have?" Lydia had asked, her pen poised over a legal pad. "My husband kept detailed records of our family's financial interactions," I'd replied, sliding a thick folder across her desk. "Carter has been borrowing money from family accounts for years, always promising to pay it back. But the pattern suggests he's been using new client funds to cover old debts." Lydia had studied the documents with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. After an hour, she'd looked up with the kind of smile that made me understand why she was so feared in financial circles. "This is a classic Ponzi scheme structure," she'd said. "If your son is doing what I think he's doing, he's looking at federal charges. Securities fraud, wire fraud, possibly money laundering. We're talking about decades in prison. How long will it take to prove?" I'd asked. "Give me 2 weeks. If he's been sloppy, and most of them are, I'll have enough evidence to bury him." Now, watching Carter's face crumble as Lydia Johnson explained why she was there, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pure, unadulterated satisfaction. The kind of satisfaction that came from knowing your enemy had finally met their match. My phone buzzed. A text from Penelope. "Mom, Carter says someone is investigating his business. This is harassment. We need to talk." I smiled and deleted the message without responding. That evening, I drove to Penelope's house in Bronxville. The Tudor-style colonial was everything she'd ever wanted. Prestigious address, perfectly manicured lawn, 3-car garage housing her BMW, Michael's Mercedes, and the Range Rover they'd bought for their daughter's 16th birthday. All of it financed by debt, of course. Penelope and Michael lived like royalty on a surgeon's salary that barely covered their extravagant lifestyle. I parked across the street and waited. At exactly 7:30 p.m., Penelope emerged from the house wearing her tennis outfit, heading for her evening match at the country club. She'd been playing tennis 3 times a week for 15 years, part of her carefully constructed image as the perfect suburban mother. What she didn't know was that I'd been making some calls of my own. The Bronxville Country Club was a bastion of old money and older prejudices. Penelope had fought for membership for years, finally gaining entry when Michael's surgical skills became too valuable to ignore. She treasured her membership like a medieval knight treasured his armor. It was her protection against the world, her proof that she belonged among the elite. I'd had lunch with Patricia Whitmore the day before. Patricia was the club's membership chairwoman, a woman who'd known me since Penelope was in diapers. She was also someone who valued discretion and despised dishonesty. "Ellen, I'm so sorry about Sebastian," Patricia had said, her voice carrying genuine sympathy. "He was such a good man." "Thank you, Patricia. Actually, I wanted to speak with you about something rather delicate." I'd told her about the funeral, about Carter's public assault on his grieving mother, about the way my children had attempted to manipulate me into giving up my home. I'd spoken quietly, sadly, like a mother sharing her deepest shame. "I'm afraid I've failed them somehow," I'd concluded. "They seem to think that money is more important than family, that their inheritance matters more than their mother's dignity." Patricia's face had gone through several interesting expressions: shock, disgust, and finally, a cold anger that I recognized as the fury of the truly privileged when confronted with bad breeding. "That's appalling," she'd said. "Absolutely appalling. In my day, children who behaved that way would be ostracized from decent society. I don't want to cause trouble for Penelope," I'd lied smoothly. "I know how much the club means to her. Ellen, dear, the club has standards. Membership isn't just about financial standing, it's about character. If Penelope has been publicly disrespectful to her widowed mother, well, that reflects poorly on all of us. Now, as I watched Penelope's BMW disappear down the street, I wondered how long it would take for the club's disciplinary committee to reach their decision. Patricia had promised to bring the matter to their attention at the next board meeting. My phone rang. Carter. Mom, we need to talk. Now. His voice was different, strained, desperate. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. I'm sorry, Carter. I don't think we have anything to discuss. Mom, please. This is serious. Someone is investigating my business, asking questions about my clients. I think Penelope's membership at the club is in jeopardy. This isn't a coincidence. I felt a smile spread across my face. No, it's not a coincidence. What did you do? His voice was barely a whisper. I did what you suggested, I said calmly. I started making responsible decisions. Mom, you don't understand. If this investigation goes public, I could lose everything. My job, my reputation, my freedom. Penelope could lose her membership, her social standing. Your kids will learn that actions have consequences, I interrupted. Something you never learned. Please, Mom. I'm sorry about the funeral. I was upset. I wasn't thinking clearly. But this is too much. You're destroying our lives. No, Carter. You destroyed your own lives. I'm simply allowing the consequences to unfold. What do you want? He asked, and I could hear tears in his voice. Money? I'll find a way to pay you back. An apology? I'll grovel if that's what it takes. Just call off the investigation. I want you to remember this moment, I said. I want you to remember what it feels like to be helpless, to have your security stripped away by someone who's supposed to love you. I want you to remember that feeling every day for the rest of your life. I hung up and turned off my phone. The evening was beautiful, cool and clear, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. I drove home to my house, my sanctuary, my fortress. In the kitchen, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the table where Sebastian and I had shared thousands of meals. His chair sat empty across from me, but I no longer felt the crushing weight of his absence. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of a job well done. Tomorrow, Lydia Johnson would deliver her preliminary findings to the Securities and Exchange Commission. By the end of the week, Carter's world would begin to crumble in earnest, and I would be here, in my house, watching it all unfold with the patience of a woman who had finally learned the difference between love and justice. Lydia Johnson called on a Tuesday morning while I was having coffee in Sebastian's favorite chair. The November sun streamed through the bay windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors he'd refinished with his own hands 30 years ago. We have him, she said without preamble. Your son has been running a textbook Ponzi scheme for at least 3 years. He's stolen approximately $2.8 million from client accounts. I set down my coffee cup with steady hands. How much evidence do you have? Enough to put him away for 20 to 30 years. Wire transfers, falsified statements, forged documents. He's been using new client investments to pay returns to existing clients while skimming money for his personal expenses. The SEC will be very interested in this. And his employer? Whitman and Associates will fire him the moment they learn about this. They'll also sue him for damages to their reputation. He'll be personally liable for millions in civil penalties, separate from the criminal charges. I thanked Lydia and hung up. Then I called my lawyer, Richard Brennan, a man who'd handled our family's legal affairs for 2 decades. Ellen, I have to ask, Richard said after I'd explained what I wanted him to do. Are you certain about this course of action? Once we file these documents, there's no going back. I'm certain, I replied. Proceed with the trust modifications immediately. The Morrison Family Trust had been Sebastian's idea, but I'd been the one to structure it. 20 years ago, we'd placed most of our assets, the house, the investment accounts, the business interests, into an irrevocable trust with specific provisions. Carter and Penelope were named as beneficiaries, but only under certain conditions. Conditions they'd never bothered to read. Specifically, the trust contained a morality clause. If either beneficiary was convicted of a felony or engaged in behavior that brought dishonor to the family name, they would be permanently excluded from inheritance. Sebastian had insisted on the clause after watching his brother's children destroy themselves with drugs and gambling. "Your children think they're entitled to our money," he'd said. "Let's make sure they earn it." By noon, Richard had filed the paperwork to invoke the morality clause. Carter's criminal investigation alone was sufficient grounds, but I wanted to be thorough. I'd also documented his assault on me at the funeral, complete with witness statements from shocked guests who'd seen their golden boy reveal his true nature. Penelope's fate was sealed by her own actions. The country club's board had voted unanimously to revoke her membership pending a full investigation into her character. The official letter cited conduct unbecoming to club standards and public displays of disrespect toward family elders, but that was just the beginning. I'd spent the week making phone calls, each one more satisfying than the last. To Emma's private school, where I'd been a generous donor for years. To the charity boards where Penelope served as a volunteer. To the medical practice where Michael worked, where I'd recommended several wealthy friends as patients. The beauty of destroying someone's reputation is that you don't need to lie. You simply need to tell the truth to the right people. "I'm calling about Penelope Morrison," I'd told the headmistress at Emma's school. "I wanted to make sure you were aware of some recent developments regarding her family situation." I'd spoken with the measured grief of a concerned grandmother, explaining how my daughter had attempted to manipulate me into selling my home at my husband's funeral. How she'd stood by while her brother physically assaulted their grieving mother. How she'd shown no remorse for their public humiliation of a widow on the worst day of her life. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," I'd concluded. "But I thought you should know what kind of values Emma is being taught at home." The headmistress had been appropriately horrified. By the end of the week, Emma would receive a letter informing her that her enrollment was being reconsidered due to family circumstances that conflict with school values. Thursday afternoon, both my children appeared at my door. I watched through the peephole as they stood on my porch, the porch Sebastian had built when Carter was 5 years old, where we'd taken countless family photos, where they'd posed in prom dresses and graduation gowns. They looked terrible. Carter's usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled. Penelope's makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes, or the way her hands shook as she pressed my doorbell again and again. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. "Mom, please," Penelope said, her voice breaking. "We need to talk." "I don't think we do," I replied calmly. "You made your feelings about me quite clear at your father's funeral." "The club revoked my membership," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Emma's school is questioning her enrollment. Michael's partners are asking questions about our family situation. You're destroying our lives." "I'm not destroying anything," I said. "I'm simply allowing the consequences of your actions to unfold naturally." Carter stepped forward, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. "You vindictive bitch. Do you have any idea what you've done? I could go to prison because of you." "You could go to prison because you're a thief," I corrected. "I didn't steal money from your clients. I didn't forge documents or falsify investment returns. I simply made sure the right people knew what kind of man you really are." "Those people trusted me," he said, his voice cracking. "Their life savings, their retirement funds. And you stole from them," I finished. "Just like you tried to steal from me." Penelope grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my flesh. "Mom, please, I'll apologize. I'll do whatever you want. Just call off the investigation. Fix this." I looked down at her hand on my arm, then back at her desperate face. "Let go of me." She released my arm immediately, stepping back as if I'd burned her. "You want to know what I want?" I asked, my voice steady and cold. "I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember what it feels like to lose everything you thought was secure. I want you to understand that the woman you treated like a burden, like a nuisance to be managed, was the only thing standing between you and the consequences of your choices." "We're your children," Carter said, his voice barely a whisper. "We made mistakes, but we're still your children." "No," I said, and the word fell between us like a stone. "My children died at Sebastian's funeral. The people standing on my porch are strangers who happen to share my DNA." I started to close the door, but Penelope wedged her foot against it. "What about Emma?" she asked desperately. "What about Jackson and Lily? They're innocent in all this." They're your grandchildren. For a moment, I felt something crack in my chest. Emma, with her bright smile and her love of books. Jackson, who'd inherited Sebastian's gentle nature. Lily, barely 10 years old, who still sent me crayon drawings of our family. But then I remembered Carter's hand across my face. Penelope's cold calculation as she discussed selling my home. The way they'd humiliated me in front of everyone I'd known for decades. Your children will learn that actions have consequences, I said. Perhaps they'll become better people than their parents. I closed the door and turned the deadbolt. Through the wood, I could hear Penelope sobbing, and Carter's voice, low and threatening, promising consequences of his own. I walked to the kitchen and made myself another cup of tea. Outside, car doors slammed and engines started. My children drove away from my house for the last time, though they didn't know it yet. Tomorrow, the SEC would announce Carter's arrest. By the weekend, the local newspapers would pick up the story. Prominent investment advisor charged with defrauding clients. Penelope's name would be mentioned as his sister, forever linking her to his crimes. I sat in Sebastian's chair and watched the sun set over the garden we'd planted together. The roses needed pruning, but that could wait until spring. I had all the time in the world now. All the time in the world, and no one left to share it with. But that was a choice I'd made, and I felt no regret. Some betrayals were too deep for forgiveness. Some wounds were meant to scar. The arrest made the front page of the Westchester County newspaper. I read it over my morning coffee, savoring each carefully chosen word. Local investment advisor charged in $2.8 million fraud scheme. There was Carter's headshot, his professional photo from the Whitman & Associates website, looking confident and trustworthy. The same face that had sneered at me over Sebastian's casket. The same hand that had struck me in front of a room full of mourners. The article was thorough. It detailed the Ponzi scheme, the falsified documents, the elderly clients who'd lost their life savings. It mentioned his prestigious address in Scarsdale, his membership in exclusive clubs, his 2 young children. It painted a picture of a man who'd had everything and thrown it away for greed. My phone had been ringing since dawn. Reporters wanting comments from the family, neighbors curious about the scandal, old friends offering sympathy that felt more like voyeurism. I'd let them all go to voicemail. I had nothing to say to any of them. By noon, the story had been picked up by the financial news networks. By evening, it would be national news. Carter Morrison, the golden boy who'd grown up in privilege and attended the finest schools, was now the face of white-collar crime in America. I drove to the supermarket that afternoon, partly for groceries, but mostly to gauge the town's reaction. Westchester was a small community despite its wealth. Everyone knew everyone, and scandal traveled faster than wildfire. At the grocery store, conversations stopped when I entered. Not in a cruel way. These people had known me for decades. They looked at me with the mixture of pity and fascination reserved for the families of notorious criminals. Poor Ellen Morrison, they were thinking. Such a good woman, such a devoted mother. How could she have raised such a monster? Ellen, dear. Lydia Finch approached me in the produce section, her voice dripping with false sympathy. I'm so sorry about all this business with Carter. It must be devastating for you. Lydia lived 3 streets over and had always resented that my children had been more successful than hers. Now she could barely contain her glee at their downfall. Thank you for your concern, I replied evenly, selecting apples with the care of a woman who had all the time in the world. I just can't imagine how you must be feeling, she continued, moving closer. I mean, to find out your own son was stealing from innocent people, elderly people with retirement savings. Lydia, I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. I appreciate your concern, but I don't need your pity. My son made his choices. Now he's facing the consequences. She stepped back, clearly taken aback by my lack of maternal anguish. Well, yes, but surely you had no idea. I knew exactly what kind of man my son was, I said calmly. I've known for quite some time. The implication hung in the air between us. Lydia's face went through several interesting expressions as she processed what I'd just said. The idea that I might have known about Carter's crimes, might even have been instrumental in exposing them, was clearly beyond her comprehension. I finished my shopping and drove home, feeling lighter than I had in months. The house welcomed me back with its familiar silence, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the hollow emptiness of grief, but the peaceful stillness of a job well done. That evening, Linda called. Carter's wife had always been the smarter of the two, the one who'd married him for his potential rather than his character. Her voice was steady, controlled, but I could hear the fear underneath. "Ellen, I need you to know that I'm filing for divorce," she said without preamble. "I'm taking the children and moving back to my parents' house in Connecticut." "That's probably wise," I replied. "The FBI seized our accounts this morning. Everything. The house is in foreclosure. Carter's legal fees alone will bankrupt us, assuming we had anything left to begin with." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. "I want you to know that Jackson asked about you," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "He wanted to know if Grandma Ellen was okay, if we could visit you for Thanksgiving like we always do." The mention of my grandson hit me like a physical blow. Jackson, with his serious dark eyes and his love of chess, Sebastian had been teaching him to play before the cancer took hold. They'd spent hours at the board in the den, Sebastian patiently explaining strategy while Jackson absorbed every word. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him that Grandma Ellen needed some time alone right now, that maybe we could see you when things settled down." "That was kind of you." "Ellen," Linda's voice took on a pleading tone, "I know what Carter did at the funeral was unforgivable. I know he and Penelope have treated you terribly. But the children will be fine," I interrupted. "You're a good mother, Linda. You'll protect them from the worst of this. Will we ever see you again?" she asked, and I could hear tears in her voice. I closed my eyes, picturing Jackson's face the last time I'd seen him, at Sebastian's birthday party in September. He'd been so proud to show his grandfather a chess problem he'd solved, so eager for approval and praise. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I truly don't know." After I hung up, I sat in Sebastian's chair and stared at the chess set in the corner. The pieces were still arranged from his last game with Jackson, frozen in time like everything else in this house. My phone buzzed with a text from Penelope. "Mom, please, I'm begging you. Michael lost 2 patients today. People are calling us, saying terrible things. Emma won't come out of her room. Just tell me what you want me to do to fix this." I deleted the message without responding. An hour later, another text. "I know you're angry. I know we hurt you. But this is destroying innocent people. Emma didn't do anything wrong. Jackson and Lily didn't do anything wrong. Please don't punish them for our mistakes." This one was harder to delete. I stared at Emma's name on the screen, remembering the bright 16-year-old who'd hugged me at Sebastian's birthday party, who'd written me thank you notes for every gift, who'd called me just to talk about books and school and her dreams for the future. But then I remembered Penelope's face at the funeral, cold and calculating as she discussed my future like I was a problem to be solved. I remembered her standing silently while her brother struck me, while he called me a burden in front of everyone we knew. I deleted the message. The third text came at midnight. "You've won. Carter will go to prison. I've lost everything that mattered to me. My children think I'm a monster. Michael barely speaks to me. You've destroyed our lives completely. I hope it was worth it." This time I didn't delete the message. I read it twice, then typed back, "Yes, it was." The next morning brought news that Penelope had been fired from her volunteer position with the Children's Hospital Charity Board. The official reason was restructuring, but everyone knew the truth. The Morrison name had become toxic, a liability that no respectable organization could afford to associate with. I made myself breakfast and ate it slowly, savoring each bite. Through the kitchen window, I could see the bird feeder Sebastian had hung last spring. A cardinal perched on it now, bright red against the gray November sky. Beautiful creatures, cardinals. They mated for life and were fiercely protective of their territory. Sebastian would have liked seeing the cardinal. He'd always said that birds were the freest creatures on earth, answerable to no one but themselves. I finished my breakfast and washed the dishes. The house was perfectly quiet, perfectly peaceful. Outside, the world continued its relentless spin, carrying my children toward whatever future they'd carved out for themselves. But inside these walls, time had stopped, and I was exactly where I belonged. 6 months later, I sat in the back row of the federal courthouse as Carter received his sentence. 25 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole for the first 10 years. The judge's words echoed through the sterile courtroom. "Mr. Morrison, you violated the trust of vulnerable elderly clients who depended on you for their financial security. Your crimes were not born of desperation, but of greed and entitlement." Carter stood with his shoulders hunched, wearing an ill-fitting public defender's suit. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and he'd lost at least 30 pounds. Prison would age him further. By the time he was released, he'd be an old man with no money, no reputation, and no family waiting for him. I felt nothing as I watched him led away in handcuffs. Not satisfaction, not regret, just the cold certainty that justice had been served. Penelope wasn't in the courtroom. She'd moved to Florida 6 months ago, after Michael divorced her and gained custody of Emma. The scandal had destroyed his medical practice. Patients didn't want to be treated by the husband of a convicted fraudster's sister. He'd taken a position at a community clinic in Ohio, as far from the Morrison name as he could get. Penelope now worked as a cashier at a chain restaurant in Pensacola, living in a studio apartment and driving a 15-year-old Honda. Emma had refused all contact with her mother since the arrest. Michael had testified in the custody hearing that Penelope had become emotionally unstable and potentially dangerous to our daughter's well-being. I knew all of this because I'd made it my business to know. Lydia Johnson had become more than just my forensic accountant. She'd become my intelligence network, keeping me informed of every development in my former children's lives. After the sentencing, I drove home to my house. The same house Carter and Penelope had tried to force me to sell. The same house they'd called too big and too expensive for a widow to maintain. I'd spent the last 6 months making it truly mine. I'd redecorated the master bedroom, removing all traces of Sebastian's illness. I'd converted his office into a library, lined with the books I'd always wanted to read but never had time for when I was being the perfect wife and mother. The garden had been completely redesigned. Gone were the rose bushes Sebastian had loved. Too much maintenance for a woman alone. Too many thorns hidden among the beauty. In their place, I'd planted succulents and native grasses, plants that thrived on neglect and grew stronger in harsh conditions. The house phone rarely rang now. Most of our old friends had distanced themselves after the scandal, unsure how to navigate the social minefield of maintaining a friendship with the mother of a convicted felon. I didn't miss their awkward sympathy or their gossip disguised as concern. My doorbell did ring, though, 3 times in the past month, to be exact. The first time had been Linda, Carter's ex-wife. She'd stood on my porch holding Jackson's hand, her face hopeful and desperate. Jackson had grown taller, his dark eyes serious beyond his 8 years. "Ellen, I know you don't owe us anything," Linda had said, "but Jackson misses you. He asks about you constantly. He wants to show you how much better he's gotten at chess." I'd looked down at my grandson through the glass of the storm door, seeing Sebastian's gentle nature and his patient expression. For a moment, I'd felt the old pull of maternal instinct, the urge to gather him close and pretend none of this had ever happened. But then I'd remembered Carter's hand across my face, Penelope's calculating eyes as she discussed selling my home. I'd remembered how they'd humiliated me in front of everyone I'd known, how they'd treated me like a burden to be managed rather than a person to be respected. "I'm sorry," I'd said through the door, "but that's not possible." Linda's face had crumpled. "Ellen, please. He's just a child. He doesn't understand why Grandma Ellen won't see him anymore." "Then you'll have to help him understand," I'd replied. "Children need to learn that actions have consequences, even when those actions are committed by their parents." I'd watched them walk back to their car, Jackson turning to look at me one last time, before Linda helped him into his booster seat. He'd waved, a small, sad gesture that had nearly broken my resolve, but nearly wasn't enough. I'd closed the door and returned to my book. The second visitor had been Emma, now 17, and legally able to make her own decisions about family contact. She'd grown into a beautiful young woman, tall and poised like her mother, but with an intelligence in her eyes that reminded me of Sebastian. "Grandma Ellen?" she'd said when I'd opened the door. "I know you probably don't want to see me, but I needed to ask you something." I'd let her into the foyer, just the foyer, and waited. "Did you really do it?" she'd asked, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Did you really destroy my parents' lives on purpose?" "Yes," I'd said simply. "I did." She'd stared at me for a long moment, processing this confirmation of what she'd probably already known. "Why?" "Because they chose to humiliate and abuse me at the worst moment of my life," I'd replied. "Because they treated me like a burden rather than a person. Because they felt entitled to my money and my home without offering respect or gratitude in return." "But what about me?" she'd asked, her voice breaking. "What about Jackson and Lily? We didn't do anything wrong." "No, you didn't," I'd agreed. "But your parents did. And children suffer for their parents' choices. That's how the world works." "That's not fair," she'd whispered. "No," I'd said. "It's not fair, but it's justice." She'd left without another word, and I'd known I'd never see her again. The third visitor had been Penelope herself, just 2 weeks ago. She'd looked terrible, thin, hollow-eyed, wearing clothes that had seen better days. The polished suburban princess had been replaced by a broken woman who'd lost everything that had ever mattered to her. "Mom," she'd said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. For the funeral, for trying to make you sell the house, for not stopping Carter when he hit you. I was wrong. We were both wrong." I'd stood in my doorway, studying this stranger who'd once been my daughter. "Yes, you were. Can you ever forgive me?" she'd asked, tears streaming down her face. "Can we find a way back to each other?" I'd considered her question carefully, weighing the possibility of reconciliation against the memory of her betrayal. In the end, the answer had been simple. "No," I'd said. "Some things can't be forgiven. Some wounds don't heal." "Please," she'd begged. "I've lost everything. My husband, my daughter, my home, my reputation. You're all I have left." "You're wrong," I'd replied calmly. "You have nothing left, and that's exactly what you deserve." I'd closed the door and watched through the window as she'd sat in her car for 20 minutes, sobbing. Eventually, she'd driven away, and I'd known she wouldn't be back. Now, 6 months after Carter's sentencing, I sit in my perfectly quiet house, reading my books and tending my low-maintenance garden. I have no family, no close friends, no one who depends on me or expects anything from me. I am completely, utterly alone. And I have never been happier. Some people might call me heartless. They might say that family should forgive family, that love should triumph over pride, that grandchildren shouldn't suffer for their parents' sins. But those people have never been slapped in the face at their spouse's funeral. They've never been called a burden by the children they sacrificed everything to raise. They've never learned the difference between love and justice. I am 63 years old, and I finally understand who I am. I am not a mother. I am a woman who was betrayed by the people she loved most. I am not a grandmother. I am someone who chose consequences over sentiment. I am not heartless. I simply have a heart that no longer beats for people who proved themselves unworthy of its rhythm. In the end, revenge isn't about making others suffer. It's about reclaiming your own power, your own worth, your own right to demand respect. My children thought they could treat me like a discarded object, something to be managed and manipulated and eventually disposed of. They were wrong. And now they know it. So here I am, recording this for you, sharing my story with strangers who might understand what it means to choose justice over forgiveness. If you've stayed until the end, you understand why some betrayals are too deep for redemption, why some wounds are meant to scar, why some mothers choose to bury their children while they're still breathing. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to know if you think I made the right choice, because I know I did.